I've been told, I guess this is right, that if you go through all three, you've read the entire New Testament. Isn't that right?
Well, the A, B, and C readings, you get most of the New Testament and a big chunk of the Old Testament.
Right, yeah, right.
And aren't they different Gospels depending on which year it is?
Like one's Matthew, one's Mark. Yeah, oh yeah. That's where it's at. Exactly. Other questions? Okay, let's talk about hierarchy. If you ever question why a bishop or a priest has the authority or where it came from, I'm going to refer to Scripture on this, and I'd like to read a little Scripture to you. Thank you. Yeah. I'm sure you're all familiar with the time when Christ was asked his disciples, who do the people say that I am? And then they say, well, they say you're the, let's see, it says, Jesus came to his district, Son of Man is, and some said John the Baptist, others said Elijah, others said Jeremiah, or one of the prophets. He said to them, who do you say that I am? Simon Peter replied, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus answered him, blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. I'll give the keys to the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. And this is a study Bible, and it's got some comments on that, and I really want to read it because they say it a lot better than I can. It talks about the keys, a symbol of teaching and authority. Jesus consecrates Peter as the church's chief teacher, whose office will continue on through successors. The plural use of keys may imply a connection with the gates and mean that Peter's position includes, among other things, the authority to release the righteous souls who are detained in Hades but destined for heaven. Where would that be? How about purgatory? Okay. Then in the Old Testament Davidic Empire, the king appointed a cabinet of ministers for specific tasks in the kingdom. Of these, a prime minister was elevated to the unique status of authority, ranking only second to the king. The government structure was common among kingdoms in the ancient Near East. Jesus here evokes Isaiah 22:15-25, Old Testament, where the prime minister's office is handed on to a successor by the symbolic act of handing on the key of the house. In Matthew, Jesus is the new Davidic king who appoints Peter the prime minister over the kingdom of heaven in the church. As in Isaiah 22, Peter's position is designed for him and his successors. The office is meant to endure as long as the kingdom itself. Entrusted with the keys, Peter wields Christ's own authority, whatever you bind or loose. Familiar language in early Jewish literature. The metaphor carries several connotations. It signifies teaching authority and the ability to render binding decisions. Rabbis in the Old Testament were said to make binding interpretations of the law. It denotes the authority to include or exclude members of a religious community. It signals the forgiveness of sins. The verb loose is used in a way meaning freed, and by the early church fathers. Peter is thus invested with Christ's authority as the kingdom's chief teacher and administrator. Through him, heaven governs the church on earth. Through him, through Peter and his successors. That make sense? Don't like reading, but they do a heck of a lot better job than I do. All right. How did Jesus tell the apostles to govern or rule? In what manner? And we're going to go to Matthew 20 there. And it says, just a second. But Jesus called them into him. This was right after the mother of James and John asked Jesus to let them sit on the right and the left, all right, in his kingdom. And Jesus says that can't happen. It says, but Jesus called them to and said, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them. The great men exercise authority over them. It shall not be so among you, talking to his apostles, but whoever would be great among you must be your servant. And whoever would be first among you must be your slave, even as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. So, all ordained, and all of us for that matter, are here to serve. So, a lot of times people get mixed up about hierarchy and think that the Pope's something special or anything. He's here to serve. And I think it's a great example of the priest that we have in our diocese and all over the world, and that they are servants. I've known a lot of priests in my life. And I've been very fortunate. I've never been around the bad one, and some I like better than others. But they all were servants to us. They gave up their life so they could serve us. A great example, and you can see all the servants back there on the wall, and I've known them all. One of the first ones up there is Monsignor Carroll, which is where the Carroll room is named after. He was here for like 50 years, and he was very well known in town. But back then, he's an Irishman and very tight with his money, and did a lot of things for the church because of that. But they said that he died a few years before I was born, so it was like 52 or 53 that he died. But they said that prior to that, for many days of the week, he would walk from St. Mary's to St. Michael's to say Mass and then walk back. You know where St. Michael's is? That, Good Shepherd's Home, on Malvern? And so he was, that's a real servant that does stuff like that, But there's been some great ones up there. One of my all-time favorites is Monsignor Leo, who was as humble a man as I've ever been around, and a wonderful, wonderful priest. But we've got a great example right now in our parish, and it's Father Robbie. He tells the story about, and while he was in India, as a pastor in India, rode his bike 10 miles to say Mass for his parishioners. Monsignor Carroll didn't have anything on him. And can you imagine any of us doing that? And so, the priests have given up, and I'm speaking of priests, ordained people have given up a lot to serve us. And, most of the priests I know, they could have been doctors, lawyers, anything they wanted to do, but they decided to be a priest. Now, I want to talk. Well, let's go over this. I don't have one. The list of Thanks. The hierarchy. Remember in the video, or in the readings that not in the video, but in the readings I talked about was how Jesus gave his authority to Peter and to his successors. And so if you'll look at this, this is the hierarchy of the Roman Catholic Church. It's the ordered grade of ordained ministers responsible to teach, rule, and sanctify the church. Top of the list is the Pope. First Pope was Peter. And please know that we have historical evidence of every Pope since then to today. So we have historical proof of that. He's the Bishop of Rome, the Vicar of Christ, speaks with bishops as the voice of Jesus Christ. Now, we're going to talk about one of the next videos talks about infallibility a little bit, and it also talks about when he's infallible and when he speaks with the bishops and when that is infallible. It's kind of interesting. I think you'll like it. Cardinals, their primary duty is to select the Pope. You've seen, all of y'all I'm sure seen that when they selected Pope Francis. There's 193 of them worldwide. They are the closest advisors to the Pope. And you know, I didn't know this, but they are not ordained cardinals. They're just selected by the Pope. Now, archbishops, they serve over several dioceses. They're above bishops. And that's and then you've got the bishops, which the archbishop takes care of several dioceses. The bishop takes care of one. He's high priesthood, member of the Episcopal office, which means that if there is a council, he goes to it. He's an advisor of the Pope as well as the cardinals are. All the cardinals are bishops, by the way. He teaches, rules, sanctifies. Pope must approve the ordination of bishops, presides over one diocese and many parishes. Then there's the priest, the co-worker of the bishop. They preach the gospel, acts in the person of Christ, particularly in the confessional, where he can absolve your sins, and he performs all the sacraments except one, which would be holy orders. He can't ordain himself. Right? Then there's deacons they are ordained to service, not to the priesthood. They assist the bishops and the priests. They can preach, they can bless marriages, and preside at funerals. Then there's the laity. That's me and you, the people. We are priests called to spread the gospel. Now let's listen to this next one if I can find it, okay? Oh, we need to make it small. Oh, thank you. That's pretty good. Let's see. Order.
Why is the church organized with the hierarchy that it has? Well, you got to remember that when Jesus founded the church, he didn't just found it in a vacuum. He founded it on St. Peter and the 12 apostles when he said, "You are a rock, and on this rock I will build my church." He addressed his teaching to the apostles, and he prays for them when he is gone. They are the founding fathers of the church, and they spread out over especially the Eastern Roman Empire, but in some places a little further, to spread that good news. But they started dying off. They were all martyred. And many of the eyewitnesses of Jesus died off, some martyred, some died naturally. And after founding these communities, either before they died or when they moved on, they established a method of succession. And the successors to the apostles are the bishops. Now, over time, the church came to recognize the successor of Peter as the unifying head of all the bishops throughout the world. And specifically, the Bishop of Rome was recognized as a successor not just to the apostles, but specifically the successor to Peter. Now again, the Pope doesn't rule in a vacuum any more than Peter administered in a vacuum. He was one among 12, and the Pope is one among many bishops throughout the world. But what distinguishes the Catholic Church and other Christian churches that are Catholic is their bishop, their leader, is united with the unifying head in Rome, the successor to Peter. And he is that unifier of all the churches throughout the world. He is the highest authority, but he doesn't work in a vacuum. He works with all the other apostolic successors, which are the bishops throughout the world. And the priests are extensions of the bishops in their individual dioceses. As a priest, I'm nothing if I'm not connected to a local bishop. Even seminarians need to be connected and approved and accepted by a local bishop. And so it's a hierarchy of organization to preserve the teaching of the church and organize the teaching of the church so that it doesn't scatter into chaos, into all different factions. But there's that one unifying factor, principally in Jesus, but in those he left to be the founding fathers of the church, the 12 apostles with their unifying head in Peter, and we have our apostolic successors and the bishops with their unifying head in the Pope, who specifically succeeds St. Peter as the head, unifying head of all the bishops throughout the world. Well, a common misconception of the Holy Father is that he's a benevolent dictator of dogma, where if he wants to change a teaching, he can because he has the authority to change that teaching. What the Pope will build upon is not necessarily liking or disliking the teaching of a previous Pope, but building upon the previous teachings of the Popes on the teachings of the Church. Many people would wish the current Pope to change such teachings, say, on morality, sexuality, birth control, and so on. And they'll say he has the power to change that teaching. But actually he doesn't. His authority is in preserving the teaching of the Church, and previous Holy Fathers have found different ways and different angles to address that teaching to its current circumstances and to apply the teaching. And so popes will look back on the ways that previous popes had applied that teaching and perhaps make use of it to their own creative application of the teaching of the Church to address the current issues that the Church faces in the modern world. What about the infallibility of the Pope? Believe it or not, the Pope is not the only thing in the Church that is infallible. Infallibility was defined in 1868 by the First Vatican Council. It was pushed by Pope Pius IX. And it was to define what exactly is the teaching role and authority of the successor to St. Peter in light of the other bishops throughout the world and his role as the unifying head of the bishops throughout the world. And under what circumstance does he have that charism of infallibility? And the First Vatican Council defined infallibility as in the Holy Father, possessed in virtue of his office as the successor of Peter and the chief shepherd and teacher of the Church. And he has the authority of infallibility when he speaks ex cathedra. And ex cathedra means from the chair of Peter. So he has to specifically exercise that charism. It's not a charism in which he wakes up one day on a rainy day and says, wow, what beautiful weather we're having today. And there we now have as an official deposit of faith, rainy weather constitutes beautiful weather because the Pope has made that declaration. That's not what infallibility is. But the Pope makes a formal declaration from the chair of St. Peter. And since that definition of the First Vatican Council, the Pope has exercised that charism a grand total of once. In 1948, when he defined the doctrine of the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary. The First Vatican Council also says that the body of bishops carries with them the authority of infallibility when, as a unified body, in union and conjunction with the Holy Father, they exercise that magisterium as successors to the apostles. And the specific instance that illustrates this by both the First Vatican Council and the Catechism of the Catholic Church, paragraph 891, is when the bishops with the Pope speak in ecumenical council. And so it's acknowledging that in the entire history of the Church, the 21 ecumenical councils carry with it the weight of infallibility, where those councils have defined elements of faith, have defined charisms of the Church. And even even in the case of the Second Vatican Council, where there are some factions within the church that say the council was invalid. If we look at the definition of the Council of First Vatican, Vatican II is not invalid. Vatican II is infallible because it's the bishops throughout the world exercising that magisterium with the Holy Father. So when it comes to the bishops together exercising that magisterium, we've seen it in the Ecumenical Council 21 times in history. Once in the Second Vatican Council, since the formal definition in the First Vatican Council. But of the Pope exercising a personal charism of infallibility, that too has been exercised perhaps a number of times before the formal definition. But since the formal definition in Vatican I, the Pope has exercised that infallible charism once in the definition of the doctrine of the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary. So it's not simply anything the Pope says is to be held infallibly, nor does it mean that if he isn't speaking infallibly, we don't listen to him. But what it defines is a formal charism of the Pope to define matters of faith and morals when he speaks from the chair, when he speaks ex cathedra, or when the body of bishops, in union with the Pope, exercise that magisterium as successors to the apostles. The most obvious and clear format is when they speak in ecumenical council. Now, some people have often asked me, in light of many of the controversial teachings of the Church, especially teachings in which, even Catholics, in particular society in general, do not react positively towards. Some have asked, well, Father, why doesn't the Pope make an infallible statement about, say, birth control or abortion? And that's a very good question, because it speaks to the whole thing of, do we even need to listen to the Pope when he doesn't speak ex cathedra, when he doesn't speak infallibly? But in answer to that question regarding abortion or birth control, I answer, he doesn't have to speak ex cathedra. He doesn't have to speak infallibly, because that is a teaching of the Church based on fundamental principles of life, marriage, human sexuality, the creation of life, that has always been with the Church throughout history. And it is a teaching that is held by the Pope and all the bishops throughout the world. So this is not a teaching that is a result of the Pope sitting in the chair of Peter and speaking ex cathedra, nor is this necessarily the result of an ecumenical council making a formal declaration as one body of apostolic successors against abortion or birth control. But it is a consistent and historic teaching that the Pope and all the bishops together have taught. And therefore, it doesn't need the stamp of an ecumenical council or the formal declaration of infallibility. So to the question, why doesn't the Pope make an infallible statement on such issues as that? The answer is, he doesn't have to. It already carries with it the weight of the magisterium in virtue of the foundational teachings on which it is built and on the historical consistency of those teachings.
Thank you. I think that probably one of the most common misconceptions or misunderstanding of the